Hey everybody, it's Sam. This is my initial post for Module 2. And to start off with, I will be doing my social justice project on disability, primarily focusing on brain injuries with the Gateway Clubhouse and also gender. So I'll focus on males. Moving on to the readings, one thing that I thought was interesting was that immigrants that were racialized as white were able to reap the benefits because of their whiteness. And there were other cultures, Jews, one that they pointed out, it took them a little bit longer to be considered whiteness per se, but later on it did happen that way. And moving on to the manifestations of racism, the book used 9/11 as a example for that, and how racism is more towards Arab Americans due to the circumstances and events that happened that day. And one thing I found interesting was when I went to Doha, Qatar for study abroad, the number one question everybody asked me was, did I feel safe there? And honestly, I felt just as safe as if I was here at home in the U.S. So it was interesting that will be the first question that people ask me versus how was my experience there. And the book goes on to say that racism is in all aspects of life. And I never really thought about it that way. I grew up in a predominantly white culture when I was in high school. A little bit of diversity was there, whites, blacks, Hispanics, and a few Asians. But I really didn't get the aspect of diversity until I went to college and actually was able to learn about what goes on in the world. Never really was into watching the news until the last few years. When I went to Lewisburg, it was a predominantly African American student population, so that really opened my eyes to learning different ways that people learn, even based off of race and gender. And then when I went to Peace, there was several international students, so that was interesting to learn the different cultures, not only through the textbook, but through their experiences. And one thing that I found interesting was that it said prejudice and racism are interchangeable, and the example used was a teacher was teaching a class, and a student says that it's not his fault that blacks don't write books. Excuse me. And I found that interesting because when I studied American literature at Peace, there were several authors of all different kinds of races and even genders. And it's interesting because racism is not as bad as it was probably like in the 60s and 70s, but it's still something that goes on today and that we have to face and not just put it aside. And another thing that I found interesting was the problem with Indian mascots. The book used an example of a high school football team coming out at their game and the cheerleader shouting, "Kill the Indians," and of course considered racial, probably a racial slur. And I find it interesting because when it comes to the Indians, not only for mascots, but in cartoons such as Peter Pan, what makes the red man red, as a child, you think that it's, I guess all fun and games is the best way to put it, but it's actually very racial. So starting out as a child portraying from the media, you get that image, and you might not even know it, and there's other examples of that as well. And the last thing that I'd like to talk about is racial profiling. And the book talked about, first started with African Americans. One of my jobs in high school and into college, very small store, one of my friends walked in, African American male, and the owner watched him and just was very cautious of his behavior. And he was just on top of asking questions constantly. And once he came back to the cash register, I told him that I knew the person and there was nothing wrong. So I would say typically older generations are more geared toward that, even if it's self-consciously. So just to keep aware of things of that sort. And that is all I have for everyone tonight. Sorry if you couldn't understand me very well. I'm a little sick and I've been yelling at the TV because of the Super Bowl. So I hope y'all have a great night and I look forward to hearing your responses.